Welcome to Infinite Models. If you like building aircraft, any type of armor, how about prehistoric or current wildlife? Autos of all shapes and sizes and genres, seafaring subjects of all types, and figures, vignettes, and dioramas, then this group was made for you.
So the bottom line is, in getting ready to build this F-105G, I have been reading about the Wild Weasel mission, SAM suppression, F-105s in general. I've got the Osprey books, Wild Weasels in Vietnam. I've got a couple of squadron books, not only the in action, but some other stuff. And then lo and behold, I have this book, Wild Weasel, the SAM Suppression Story, right? Yeah, the SAM Suppression Story by Larry Davis, published by Squadron Publishing. And I was reading through this thing, just looking for more inspiration and stories on F-105s. And Paulo says bourbon is a known alternative, especially for teething. You're going to rub a little of that on the gums. Kids don't cry anymore. So I'm going to open by sharing, in this book, they go through since this is the SAM suppression story. It doesn't only focus on F-105s. They're a large part of it, of course. But, the whole thing started in early Vietnam with the F-100F. And they installed some special systems on them. And this book opens up, the introduction starts talking about radar, right? Radio and detection ranging. That's what radar originally stood for before it became its own word. They talk about radar and the development of radar and shrinking it so it fits into aircraft, and how the British used it to detect the Germans coming across the English Channel in World War II. And you go through a number of these things, post-war items and radar development, and then development of radiation missiles or anti-radiation missiles. And then you get to Wild Weasel 1. And they talk about the F-100F and the SA-2 guideline missiles and the Fang Song radar and the Fan Song D, where the antennas are placed and what they're used for. And then you get in here and you learn that Wild Weasel 2 was kind of an idea, and they did a couple of tests, but it never panned out, and they moved right to Wild Weasel 3, which was based on what they called the EF, or the electric fighter 105F, two-seat version. And there's a lot of information in this until you get further into this book, and they finally address F-105G, which is what I'm going to be building. So I got to the chapter on F-105G, and I've been reading about the 37th Tactical Fighter Squadron and 13th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the 354th Tactical Fighting Squadron, and all the things that they were going through. And I will tell you that fascinating, just fascinating stuff. And it must be a Marine thing. I use bourbon. Yeah, I used to use bourbon and Chivas Regal Scotch. Rub it on the gums. So I want to read you this paragraph, then I'm going to tell you a story. So here's how the section on the F-105G opens up in the book. We're about to have a power outage here in my house. It's starting to flicker. I'm wondering if my internet's going to go down. This might get choppy. Let me tell you the story. During 1967, the Wild Weasel Force underwent many changes while flying hundreds of combat missions. By January of 1968, the 13th Tactical Fighter Squadron and the 354th Tactical Fighter Squadron had been credited with 89 SAM site kills. These were sites destroyed, and does not include the hundreds of sites that were suppressed or forced off the air, allowing the strike force to proceed to the target, basically unscathed, right? In April, the team of Major Leo Thorsness and Captain Harold Johnson became the first Weasels to shoot down a MiG when they claimed a MiG-17 with 20mm cannon fire near Hanoi. It was the first of 3 MiGs to be shot down in 1967 by Weasel crews. That the Weasel mission was no milk run is attested to by the loss of 26 aircraft and 42 Weasels either killed in action, missing in action, or prisoners of war. So that's how this section starts out, introducing the F-105G. And John Binford says a lot of them were shot down. Yeah, those the bureau numbers you sent me. So the mission was pretty incredible. Well, when it mentioned Major Thorsness as the Weasel, and his bear was Captain Harold Johnson, that they shot down the first MiG kill was claimed in April of 67. It happened to be April 19th, 1967. And I want to tell you the story about that mission. And the way that mission went, and how it was flown, the acts done by Major Thorsness are just unbelievable. So let me share the story with you. Major Leo Thorsness was one of the earliest Weasel pilots, and he was known, his nickname was the Old Weasel. He had flown up to this point 90 Wild Weasel missions and survived and returned from every single one of them. 90 Weasel missions. He was the Old Weasel. Captain Harold Johnson was his bear, sat in the back, monitored all of the raw gear, the radar homing and warning. He monitored the systems for the aiming of the Shrike and the AGM-45 standard arms. And, you know, that was his job, was detecting and identifying and pinpointing the Fansong B radar sites. And off of the radar trailer and the control trailer, you had like wagon wheel spokes out to all the launchers with like 6 or 8 SA-2 missiles, and those things launched a flying telephone pole at the aircraft. And I call them that because 37 feet and the average telephone pole is 40 feet. They're basically throwing telephone poles at airplanes. So anyway, by April of 1967, he had 90 missions, and in that time, he and Captain Johnson, his backseater, the Bear, they had 53 SAMs launched at their airplane. Now, not in general. If you guys are familiar with the radar equipment back in the day and how it worked, when you were searching for stuff, you would scan, right? And on that scan, you could get a blip when something would show up off, like a return on the radar. But the blip was not them radiating looking for you. It was a return on your radiation looking for them. So you would get a blip. If they came up and turned on their search radar, the Fansong B, the system would display one ring around that blip. It was now radiating. And they would be sweeping the sky. And if they found you as a blip and they started to narrow their search, you would get painted, is kind of the term they use, more frequently. And it would go from one ring to 2 rings. And when they had you tracked and locked and were getting ready to launch, it went to 3 rings. So you would be in the back seat monitoring the gear, looking at all the blips, and then some of the blips go 1 ring, some go 2, and some frankly go 3. And after that, a big red warning comes up on the right-hand side of the console, and it read launch, when you had a launch at your airplane. So here they are. They've knocked out all these sites, you know. They've forcing things off the air, allowing strikes to proceed onto target. And by the way, those 53 SAMs launched at them doesn't count the just countless of anti-aircraft artillery fired at them, and all of the MiGs that tried to jump them and attack them, majority of which were MiG-17, and the F-105 easily outran the MiG-17, but some of them were MiG-21s, and those weren't quite so easily outrun. Still could, but it was much. If you were jumped by a MiG-21, your chances of running away grew smaller and slimmer than a MiG-17. So these guys flew a mission 19 April 1967, and it went a little something like this. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, carbine flight, 4 F-105s, Wild Weasel aircraft, a flight of 4, took off 1 p.m. from Takli Air Base in Thailand. Their mission was a SAM suppression mission over Juan Mai, and at Juan Mai was a military barracks and a supply depot and hub. And so they were leading a strike package to take out the military barracks, lots of Vietnamese, North Vietnamese Army regulars, and they wanted to destroy the supply depot. The problem is Juan Mai was only 37 miles southwest of Hanoi. Hanoi had the densest, most heavily anti-aircraft protected defenses in the world to that point. They were only 37 miles outside of Hanoi, so they were going right into the teeth of all of that. So they took off out of Takli Air Base in Thailand. They head north up along to get into northern Laos. And what they did was they tanked up over northern Laos. All 4 aircraft got onto a tanker, topped off their tanks. And as soon as they were all topped off, they would come back down to about 8,000 feet and turn east into northern Vietnam. Now at 8,000 feet, they would actually drop in a little lower, and they'd get into the foothills and the mountains of Vietnam. And they would, as a flight of 4, would be snaking their way through these foothills in the mountains, trying to do a sneak attack on the SAM sites out around Chiang Mai, or Juan Mai. Well, guess what? Those SAM sites on this day knew they were coming, and they were ready for them. And as they're snaking their way through there, 100 miles out from the target, Major Thorsness can hear the rattlesnake growl in his headset of the search radars. And Captain Johnson in the back seat, Harold, he is just looking at blip after blip after blip. They're all over the place. And some are a single ring because they're searching the sky. Some are just blips. 100 miles out, their radar scopes are filling up. So as they continue their approach, they get about 15 miles out, and Leo splits the 4-plane flight into two ship sections, and each of them have a different quadrant to suppress around Chiang Mai. And so 15 miles out, they split into the 2 sections, and no sooner do they get split than bang, a 3-ring pops up right in front of them. And if you understand, I told you they would be painting the sky and then tracking when they narrow the search and then lock on. So they had a search radar literally at the mouth of the mountain range they were coming out of, sat quietly while the others were just painting the sky and getting a track on the airplane based on coordinating all that, and leaving this one silent until they popped out. And he came up with an immediate narrow search track on the airplanes. So they roll out 15 miles to target, 2-plane section, bang. And old Harold's in the back seat, and he goes, what's her name? Carbine flight, launch, because boom, then you get the launch light, 3-ring launch. Well, as soon as that thing came up and it was locked onto them, Major Thorsness, he had the foresight. He already had his Shrikes on, armed. He's been tracking things in there. That 3-ring came up. He locked it, and he launched the missile, rolled up on a wingtip, and heads for the deck from 8,000 feet down. He gets down there, and boom, that radar site, that Fansong B radar, just abruptly goes off the air. It was 7 miles out when he launched the missile, so he never really saw the impact. But when you go from a 3-ring track to it's off the air, he pretty much destroyed that site. Well, as it turns out, what the Vietnamese had been doing for about 6 months, starting in November of '66, was they would send false launch signals to try to goof with the Weasel crews and mess with them. And when they got that launch signal and he popped off the Shrike and dropped to the deck, it was a false launch. He and his wingman, Carbine 2, they hit the ground. They're juking along. Well, unfortunately, Carbine 2 also had a launch notice because there was a 3-ring painting his aircraft. But this time it wasn't a false launch indicator. It was a live launch. And Carbine 2 was hit. And Carbine 2 comes up on the radio, and he simply yelled out, "Carbine 2, I'm going in," or "I'm hit." And he's got fire indicator lights all over his dashboard. The plane is trailing smoke. Pieces are flying off. And Leo radios over to him and says, "Carbine 2, turn south, light your burners, and go home." So his wingman breaks off, and he turns, and he's getting ready to head south to go for home. And actually was trying to go back to the west to get into Laos, where he could safely be picked up. He didn't even make it back to the foothills. His plane went in. And as he called out on the next radio call, we're going in. So here's Leo flying along, gets hit with a 3-ring, releases a Shrike down on the deck. Now he's got to climb back to altitude, looking for the target, suppressing SAMs. Carbine 3 and 4, they hear all the stuff that's going on, and sure, they would like to break and come over and help because there was a launch. Guys are out of the cockpit, and in the middle of that, a little bit about the emergency gear, some pretty cool stuff. The pilots had a handheld radio. It was called the Prick 180, and you could actually tune to primary guard, which was 243 megahertz, or you could go to the alternate guard, was 282.8 megahertz, and you could have two-way communication. Wasn't scrambled, wasn't encoded, but you could talk to, Sandy or the Jolly Greens and get them. You could send a ping from that radio to tell them where you were at. Well, in the seat pan of the ejection seats was another thing called a Prick 119. And there was a Prick 91, and the designation was PRC 119, PRC 91. When I was in the Marine Corps, we just called them Prick 91s, Prick 119s. We all knew what they were talking about. Well, those were in the seat pan. And so when a pilot and a bear, or a single-seater with just a pilot, if you had to eject from the airplane, there was an actuator tab that was held that had a safety pin, and the pin remained in the airplane. So when the radio went out with the seat pan, it automatically started broadcasting a ping at 243 megahertz. Ping, 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 that they could track. Because if you could find the seat, you at least found close to where the pilot was. He may have been injured. He may have been injured upon landing with a parachute. His chute may not have opened and he went through the trees. He may not be conscious, so he can't talk to you on his, Prick 118. But you found the seat, you're close to the pilot. So they had a pinger. And then also in his harness and the web gear for the parachute, there was a pinger in that. So if his chute deployed, it would pull the pin and activate a 243 megahertz pinger on the parachute. So Leo turns back to the south. He knows that carbine 2 is down. He switches over to guard 243. And as he's racing back to the scene, out of nowhere, another 3-ring comes up. It's painting him. He looses a Shrike, his second Shrike shot of the day. In his after-action report from this one, he said, I don't know. There was no lock. It was a 3-ring. The Shrike should have guided. I launched my second Shrike. Say that 3 times fast. I launched my second Shrike at a surface-to-air missile site over North Vietnam. That was his after-action. However, that too went off the air shortly, so it at least suppressed it and allowed him to be an afterburner racing south to try to figure out where carbine 2 was going down. In his headset, since he switched over to guard, he heard the squeal of the parachute pinger going off in his headset. And as he's racing south, he starts to hear the second one go off. He now is feeling a little bit of relief because he knows carbine 2 and his bear both got safely out of the airplane. So at this point, he now switches over to Brigham Control, their frequencies. And Brigham Control is, that is an EC-130 that was orbiting nearby. And the purpose of Brigham Control is to coordinate the rescue stuff, ResPac aircraft, and you have the Sandy aircraft, the slow flying A1 Sky Raider types that would go in nice and low and suppress the enemy and allow the H3, the HH3, and the HH53C, the Jolly Greens and so forth to get in there and lift out the downed crews. So he flips over to Brighton Control, and he's trying to listen for what's going on with, arranging for a rescue pack. And as he's heading south, ResPac is calling off the Brighton Control and that C-130. They're calling out to Sandys, to H3s, or coordinating movement. Well, guess what? At the same time, they're relaying signals, and they're trying to tell Leo as he is racing south, you've got MiGs converging, MiGs are on you, MiGs are tracking. He's over on guard, listening for his crew to try to figure out where they're at. Completely missed all that. Next thing he knows, he gets a 3-ringer in front of him. He pumps a CBU, the cluster bomb unit, off of there to just kind of scatter over a SAM site as he blows over it. And Johnson in the back seat is screaming bloody murder at him till he realizes he's calling out MiGs, and he pulls his head up literally out of the cockpit and looks outside, and he's got MiG-17s at 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. He is bracketed by MiGs, but he's rolling up behind them. So he kicks a little rudder in to course correct, and he's closing on a MiG-17, and he squeezes the trigger and starts letting loose with his 20 millimeter cannon. And by golly, even though he was closing the speed really good, if he had hit that guy, because he missed on the first shot, and he realigned and he squeezed the trigger again, and he started hitting that MiG-17 and stuff starts flying off, and all he could think was, you know, if I'd hit this guy good, I probably would be down now, because he'd be ingesting half of that airplane as he went racing by it. But that was the first MiG kill of the Vietnam War using a Wild Weasel aircraft. He was racing after Carbine 2 to find out where they were at, and he got bracketed going in the same direction because the MiGs were going there to find them. The rescue teams will be there, easy targets, helicopters. They want to down anything American they can. So he comes racing south and winds up behind these MiGs. They didn't know he was there until their plane started falling apart from 20 Mike hits. Then they knew he was there. So the MiGs scramble, and they're trying to move around and get and maneuver into position to get on him. Well, he has to hit the burners, and he goes just, you know, he pulls back on the stick, and that thud will climb like a homesick angel, man. And he gets the heck out of there, heads back over to Laos, hits a tanker, and he can't top off. He needs, excuse me, he needs to get back in the fight. And he needs to help Carbine 2. Well, in the meantime, Carbine 3 and 4, the other echelon, they were jumped by MiGs. I can't believe this. We've got little fruit flies in here this year so bad. One just went in my throat. I'm going to kill these son of guns if I have to smoke my house. So Carbine 3 and 4 jumped by MiGs. They're doing their darndest. They release their weapons. They're suppressing SAM sites, and they got to get out of Dodge. They're being hit by a gaggle of MiGs. Well, they turn south, and they go to try to light their burners. And Carbine 3 has lost his afterburners. So their choice, he's irking and jerking wingtip to wingtip. He's pulling high G's. They finally get far enough south. The MiGs lose interest and turn back north to go re-engage other things. Carbine 3 and 4 are running for the hills. So 2 is down. 3 and 4 are gone. 1 has launched 2 Shrikes, a CBU, hit the tanker, and he's coming back, and all he has is half of his 20 millimeter ammunition, basically half a fuel load, and he's trying to race back in and make sure that he can ensure that Carbine 2 are safe and they get rescued and pulled out. So he goes racing back in, and he hears the Sandys. And what happened was those MiGs that were on Carbine 3 and 4 and other MiGs coming into the scene are now converging on the Sandys. And the Sandys are calling out, you know, they're MiGs are on us, brake right, brake left, they're going. Next thing you know, the next call was Sandy 2 is going in. Sandy 2 got hit and was taken down. Sandy 1 is on the radio. They are screaming for help. Well, ironically, Brigham Control, that C-130, earlier in this fight, it was unclear what the picture was, and there was other F-105s coming in, like Ds and strike package aircraft were coming in, and Brigham Control actually pushed them away from the environment because they didn't know how safe it would be for them to get in there, and whether it become a fur ball, how bad would it be. And so they pushed them off. Leo is rolling in as a one-man show right now. And he's going, Sandy 1, good night, Steve. He says, Sandy 1, keep turning. The MiGs can't stay with you. I'm on my way. In the meantime, Brigham Control now has a good assessment of the situation. The Sandys are under attack. One's down. One's running for his life. The 53s, or the H3s are hanging back. They're not going into this zone. And he redirects another strike package that was egressing over to help out, just to get more numbers into the fight, level the playing field. So he calls these guys in, and Leo is bearing down. So now he's on afterburner, trying to race back into the scene. And his whole thought is, if I can get the MiGs to come after me, that'll get them off Sandy's back. The 3s can roll in and get Carbine 2 and Sandy 2, be out of the area, and I can get up, take a tank, and go home. This is his plan in his head now. He's the only F-105 in the area. So he has gone from south to north, made his strike on Chiang Mai, come back south, going after his partner, into a fur ball with MiGs and more SAM sites, over Laos for a tank, back into the scene, trying to run off these MiGs, and he's on afterburner, and he's roaring back into the fight, and, you know, hang in there, Sandy 1, I'm on my way. And just as he kind of blows through, this scene's going on, there's AAA going off everywhere, Sandy's breaking, the MiGs finally had enough, or maybe they were out of fuel, but they break and they start heading home. And everybody, the H3s start to come in, the rescue operation is taking place for Carbine 2 and Sandy 2. There's a little bit of relief there. Well, another pilot from the other F-105 flight comes up on the radio to Carbine 1 and didn't address him as Carbine 1. This guy literally comes over the radio, "Leo, where are you? I got lost. I am bingo fuel." And Major Thorsness is sitting there like, "I told the tanker where to hang. I didn't fill my tanks up. I just took on enough to get back in the fight because Sandy was in trouble. You know, Carbine 2 is down. So he didn't top off his tanks. He needed that tanker to get home. But this other guy, he's like 800 pounds, bingo fuel." So he's thinking to himself, "We're just going to need a miracle here. I'm going to have to perform some magic." So he calls the tanker, calls the other pilot, and sets them up on an alternate rendezvous, you know, back out away from him. That thud goes off. He met the tanker. He got his fuel. He made it home safely. That was good news in this story. In the meantime, Leo and Harold are egressing the area with no tanker support, not a fully refueled airplane. They were racing on afterburner back in to help go save Sandy. So they're eating fuel at a precipitous rate. And now he's trying to figure out if he has enough legs to get home back to Tackley Air Base. And they came up with a plan. They climbed to an optimal cruising altitude and speed, and he had the airplane trimmed, you know, as smooth as he could make it. And they had a plan that, he, as he called it, he said, "If I can get over the fence," and that's the Mekong River, "if I can just get over the fence at this altitude, I can lower my nose and glide to Udorn. I don't have to get all the way to Tackley. I can just glide to Udorn." So they're flying along, racing as they can, and they got to the Mekong River, and he pulled the throttle back to idle and tips the nose down and starts a long glide back to Udorn Air Base. And they went down, they landed, they did hit, you know, they reverse thrusting and all that to slow down the airplane, brakes, parachutes. They get to the end of the runway, they turn to come onto the taxiway, and boom, they flame out. No gas left in that airplane at all. But they're on the ground and they were safe. Crews come out, hooking up the tow bars and everything, and a Jeep comes out to take the crew in. And these two cats, they're climbing down out of their aircraft. I just heard thunder. That's why we were losing power around here. And Captain Johnson looks at Major Thorsness and he says, "Now that's a full day's work." That was their mission, 4.5 hours. He went from south to north, north to west, west to north, north to south, rescuing people. 2 SAM sites, 1 killed, 1 suppressed. Dropped CBUs on a 3rd, but no bomb damage assessment after that. Downed a MiG with 20 Mike cannon fire, and blew through a gaggle of MiGs to get them off of Sandy 2's back, or Sandy 1's back. One heck of a mission. That was number 91 for Major Thorsness. Not much longer after that, happened on 30 April 1967. He was flying mission number 92 to Hanoi, and he and Captain Johnson were shot down by MiG-17. They were captured and they were interred at the Hanoi Hilton as prisoners of war for the next 6 years. These guys didn't get released until 4 March of 1973. They stayed 6 years as prisoners of war. During that period, you know, they were getting starved, beaten, interrogated, and everything else. The Hanoi Hilton is world-renowned for its depravity towards mankind. And when they were finally released, and Mark says, did the other crew get picked up? So that was not specific in the story, but the way it was written, I'm assuming they did, because the 3s did eventually go in. And the way it reads is that Carbine 2 and Sandy 2 both were picked up. So I believe so. Mark. So in any event, when they got released as POWs, they were taken out and they were flown down to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And they had a major, you know, Air Force hospital there. And if you understand restoring people who have been interned like that for years and starved, You can't just feed them the fatty foods we're used to eating. That kind of diet will kill them in their emaciated state. So it takes months to restore these people's health and get them back to a normal, natural diet where they can eat foods that won't kill them, and they put some natural weight back on their bodies. They can carry themselves, and that takes months. Well, as it turns out, Colonel Jack Broughton, who was the wing commander of those 2 tactical fighter squadrons, his description of that mission on 19 April 1967 was that Major Leo Thorsness and Captain Harold Johnson took on most of North Vietnam all by themselves. They fought MiGs in 3 different gaggles, 3 different SAM sites, just all over from the north to the southwest in Vietnam, northern Vietnam, and escaping out through U Don Air Base. He said they took on almost all of North Vietnam by themselves. And he wrote that when he wrote a Medal of Honor recommendation for the major and an Air Force Cross recommendation for the captain. And those guys finally received those awards in October of 1973 after recovering from their internship at the Hanoi Hilton. They were finally awarded their Medal of Honor and the Air Force Cross for that mission, 19 April 1967. And I read that story, and all I could think to myself, and if you guys have seen me looking down, sorry, I had my bullets and my notes to help make sure I got through that story good for y'all. But reading that story, I am so motivated to build this model now. And you think about the courage, just the unbridled courage of men to fight like that. Others are being directed away, and he is on afterburner back into the fray with half a load of Mike, 20 millimeter. And these guys are just, you talk about spinal columns of steel and the steeds that they flew. That F-105G, man, I'm looking forward to building.
We hope you have enjoyed this Infinite Models presentation.